Maybe sitting down here, one doesn't realize that there are now 49 cities in Africa with at least 1 million inhabitants, and that number is rising all the time. And they're spread right around the continent, combination of coastal and inland locations, obviously the largest number across West Africa, but yeah, our region has quite a number of representatives there. The flip side of vulnerability, of course, is risk. And in many poor countries, and again, South Africa is no exception, we shouldn't just kind of fixate on extreme events, you know, the dramatic headlines, or indeed the longer-term changes that are happening in terms of mean temperatures, in terms of sea level and so on. It's also crucial to understand the everyday vulnerabilities, the sort of daily stresses that poor people have in their struggles to survive. Because those are the most vulnerable people, and a relatively small change in prevailing conditions can have a disproportionate impact on those daily struggles of the poor to survive. So really, we need to look again at the underlying relationships in terms of the physical or biophysical changes, but also the structural relationships in terms of a sort of political economy or political ecology. What is it that drives that poverty and retains people in vulnerability? And how can individual projects or programs like this, focusing on food security, start to relieve some of those constraints? And that, again, is one of the values of trying to link individual projects rather than just having everybody in their own little kind of silo or ghetto, but thinking whether, through an initiative like this, the whole can become more than the sum of the individual components. And it's really, really important. And therefore, in a sense, it's not just about getting the findings of my project and aren't they wonderful and aren't I going to get a great paper in the journal of X and a nice article in Die Burger or the Cape Times or wherever. But it's about engaging with the communities you're working, engaging with politicians, engaging with all the role players, stakeholders who actually impact directly and indirectly on those vulnerabilities, on those food production and supply systems. So I'm kind of thinking systems at this point. And specifically, finally, bringing it down to urban areas, even more than globally. Even today, many national and subcontinental or regional policies, the SADCs, the COMESAs, really don't have urban coverage, and certainly are only just, in the vaguest way, beginning to think about environmental change and what it might mean. And I've just done a paper for a conference in Cape Town earlier this year, looking at the SADC and COMESA initiatives. It only started in 2007. But there's not a word in any of those documents, nice as they are and you know, quite up to date in terms of the intellectual thought underpinning them, not a word about cities or urban climate change. So the policy on those tends to be left to local authorities. National policy in South Africa, in Zimbabwe, many other countries, again, is almost entirely silent on these issues in an urban context. Urbanization strategies, and again, this country's been grappling with those thorns for as long as I can remember, but again, there's not enough consciousness of the way in which these sorts of environmental changes are going to affect the urban areas. In this country, and at least 2 others in the region, over half the national population now lives in places defined variously as urban. There are some exceptions, and again, it's still only the exceptions, and very often the metropolitan areas that are taking a lead. And Cape Town and now eThekwini are doing municipal action plans. Cape Town actually finished about 2-3 years ago, at least the first edition, trying to be proactive. But many others, and the intermediate cities and the small cities, there is no capacity, there is very little awareness, and time is being lost. There are also a series of networks at different scales, from the sort of global UN Habitat, national initiatives like the Cities Network here, and then a global network of cities, the C40 network, the Commonwealth Commission, the Commonwealth Planners Association, to do a study and a think piece which was presented last year at the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting. And then, of course, there's ICLEI, Local Governments for Sustainability. And, in fact, Local Agenda 21 is quite a good starting point in many ways, because it talks about urban sustainability, albeit in quite limited ways. But it's not up to the job, and even schemes like Cities for Climate Protection are still quite limited in conception and focus very largely on individual mitigation measures, things like fitting low-energy light bulbs to all the street lights in the city, which again are helpful, but they're never really going to get to grips with the fundamental problem. And there's very little yet on adaptation. And even the case studies presented at ICLEI's Congress in Bonn in May, if you look at the stuff, and a lot of cities are now, of course, claiming all this as part of their green, low-carbon credentialing, but actually there's still an obsession with mitigation because it's cheaper, it's easier, it's shorter term. You can please the politicians by sticking things into your annual reports. But it's at that level of longer-term adaptation that most remains to be done. And again, how do we localize the kind of global babble and help to focus what this means for Metro Cape Town or eThekwini or wherever? Part of that is downscaling climate models, looking at, again, local implications of some of the sea level rise scenarios. And here's an example of Cotonou, the capital of Benin, which of course is on the West African coast. And these figures are based on the 2007 IPCC Fourth Assessment Report. The more recent data are showing that even these are somewhat conservative. So perhaps we ought to be thinking more about the extreme than the average scenario. And the implications of that kind of sea level rise, probably not radically different from what's going to be around Southern Africa, are fairly obvious. And again, I'm going to give you two examples now and some pictures from a few other places just to help focus on what this means for real places and real people in those real places. This is Metro Lagos, the second largest metropolis on the African continent, with 16, 17, 18 million people. Nobody kind of knows. This part of the West African coast is very low-lying. It's based around an intake and the Lagos Lagoon. There are lots of coastal dune systems with a combination of permanent and seasonal waterways kind of parallel to it there. Again, some similarities to parts of the Southern Cape Coast, for example. And then the population concentration here on Lagos and Victoria Island and this part of the Lekki Peninsula, and stretched up the western side of the lagoon and into the interior. That's what it looks like from space. The grey area basically is the built-up metro area. This photo, I think, is now about 5 years old. But you can see the waterways, you can see the sorts of areas that are going to be particularly vulnerable to sea level rise, to increased frequency and severity of storm surges and so on very easily. And that modeled, the light blue and the very light blue areas are the areas that would be permanently inundated by a 1 meter rise in sea level. And that would take out the homes and the livelihoods of probably 500,000 to 1 million people. And in terms of the loss of food production, in terms of the impact of infrastructural loss, affect the entire metro population. And here's why. Hundreds of thousands of people live in rather fragile wooden houses on stilts over the lagoon waters. So obviously, in some ways, they might resist small storms, moderate sea level rises, but those structures are fairly rickety, and if they go over, well, huge implications. A lot of economic activity in terms of livelihoods, particularly for poor people, recent rural-urban migrants, and so on, based on inefficient ancient technologies of sawmilling and wood rendering, again, right on the shores, and a whole range of other things. Obvious vulnerabilities beyond a certain coping threshold. The harbour, major freeways on which the whole articulation system of probably one of the most congested places on the planet, very vulnerable as well. And further along the Ghanaian coast, Cape Coast, a large city, an example of the whole continent. Fishing communities living right on the beach, boats, the warehouses, the sheds, very vulnerable to even the smallest impacts of climate change.